Welcome to Plan9Crunch. My name is Doug Gibson, and I'm here today with Pat Nielsen, who is also known as the author Dean Patrick. And Pat has written a series of novels called the Terra Drake series. And the first one was called The Lady Mephistopheles. The second one, we can see it right here, is called Terra Sabbath. And the third one's coming out very, very soon. Pat, tell us a little bit about the Terra Drake novels.
I will. It started a long time ago, and she actually came from addiction recovery. And it started back when I was going through so many obstacles with alcoholism and addiction, and I was in a prison rehab of all places, and ended up writing a story. It came about during a terrible, terrible night while I was there. And I thought about addiction and what it represented to all the people around me, because it was mostly filled with addicts everywhere in these prisons and these rehabs and so forth that I was in and out of. That's what kind of people are there mostly. So I came up with this character who represented addiction overall, Terra Drake. And at first it started out as a sexual addiction, but it went into more of alcohol and drugs and whatever this character could lure her victims into is how she became who she is, and it went on from there.
Terra Drake exploits people's vulnerabilities, right?
She does.
Their fears, their uncertainties.
She does.
In the first book, The Lady Mephistopheles, there's a character, and his name is Stephen Paul, correct?
Stephen Paul represents me.
Yeah, and he is a man who is flawed, and she's exploiting the heck out of him, and he tries as hard as he can to try to fight against it.
He does.
Who does Terra represent maybe in history and things like that?
Historically, and this didn't come out in the first book at all. This actually was developed in Terra Sabbath and far more in this third one, but I thought biblically it could be something very interesting, and so Lilith came to mind. Lilith is historically the first wife of Adam, and different religions have looked at that, and Lilith was more of a sexual creature than was Eve, and she was kicked out of the garden, and Satan was involved in all of it. So I thought if Terra Drake could actually be this person, would be a fascinating avenue for her, and that happens in the second and third book. But in the first book, she appears to Stephen Paul after he's gone through an awful relapse. And it's kind of in the time of COVID. And the book started out, interestingly enough, I was out one night and I saw my neighbor over here, as a matter of fact, just right at my next door neighbor, who's the character Stan Smits. And he was in the hospital from COVID. And when he came out of the hospital, I was out one night, and he pulled up and talked to me, and I couldn't believe what COVID had done to him. He nearly died through it. And it was such a startling difference of who he is and what he looks like after COVID got him. I thought, that would be something else to have Terra Drake also be part of that whole horror there. And it took off from there. That scene took off to that book.
When he meets his friend in the truck,
yes,
you're just amazed at how messed up he is.
He is. He has been destroyed.
Yeah, and then there's also, in the first book, there's he goes to visit situations that would seem normal, like anything, and all of a sudden the people seem to be possessed. And I sometimes wonder, is that in his mind, or is that Terra doing those to those people?
I think you can go back and forth with it. It is Terra doing it, because she really represents all the demons I've fought. Trying to become clean, become sober after 8 years of being sober now, and seeing the things I've overcome. She represents all those things, but she uses them, as you said before, to exploit the weaknesses. And of course, Steve, going through a huge relapse in alcoholism, he starts to become a catalyst for all of the different things that she represents. But she knows he's spiraling down, and it is her goal to take him down, and he has a choice at the end on what to do with her, whether or not to live or die. And that, of course, brings up the second book when his brother gets involved with it. But Steve, though, his neighbor here, Stan, goes through, and it takes the point of view from a first-person narrative at the beginning of that book, Lady Mephistopheles, and then it goes to a third person. I go back and forth with that to show Steve what he's going through, how he's spiraling, how the madness of alcoholism kind of turns the narrative into stream of conscious at times. My influences there are Joyce and Faulkner quite a bit, because they use that style. And at first, my publisher thought that would be too dense of language, too heavy. He didn't agree with it at all. In fact, at first, he rejected the book. I had a couple of other publishers that wanted to have it, and I wanted to go with Terry Wright of TWB Press.
I was going to ask you, yeah, TWB Press is
TWB Press out of Colorado. And I wrote Terry back, and I said, can you give this another shot? And let me tell you a little bit more about the story. And I think we have something here that's unique. And he agreed. And so here we are now. Third book's coming out. It's done. I've written the manuscript. We're going through some final reviews now. It will be sent to him in the next week. We can talk about that in a little bit.
We will.
But it blossomed out from there. And my wife, Lisa, always told me when she first read the first short story about Terra Drake called She said, we need to make this, you should make this into your book, your story, what you've gone through, and have her be everything that you have overcome and that other people overcome. So you see in the first book, it is truly alcohol, drugs, but it also goes through the weaknesses of like Stan Smith's, the weaknesses of the other characters that he meets along the way. And he meets these demonic characters throughout the entire story, Steve does, until the very end.
Point. You know, the everyday situations
Every day.
in these books turn into wild, demonic things. And if you read the first book, you'll always be a little bit afraid of getting into a massage chair again.
That's great.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that scene, and I'll kind of tell you some of the methods I do for writing these books. There'll be times where I don't have anything I'm writing. I'm thinking about it in my head. I'm kind of outlining scenarios. But when a scene comes to me, I got it. And I was it was a job fair. And I was at a job fair, and I was seeing the different booths there and so forth. And I thought, what if these job fair folks that are there trying to get employment and trying to do different things, what if there's a situation there where there's another person selling these massage chairs, but when Steve goes in there and sits on the massage chair, and you've seen these chairs in malls, and they let you out, and they give you a back massage on your feet and the shoulders, and well, I thought about, what if there's a character there selling one that is truly evil? So Steve gets into this chair, and the chair comes alive, and it takes him back into every horror that he's ever suffered through. And he feels like he's going to die by the end of it. And I won't give it away, but I'm glad you remembered that scene, because a lot of people that read that book thought that scene really troubled them.
Well, it was memorable, that's for sure. All right. Now, okay, I don't want to give away plots on these things, but you have a second protagonist who I believe he's informed at the end of the first book, but he's the main guy.
He is introduced in the first book, but he
His
becomes...
name is Marion Paul. He's a police officer who's Steve's brother.
Right.
And I'm going to let you get into this, but you get more understanding of Terra Drake in the second book, which is Terra Sabbath. He wakes up in a hospital, once again, a situation where it's a normal place, and then it turns into a really funky hospital, all right, with things happening. But tell us a little bit about the second book without giving obviously everything away.
Absolutely. And at the end of the first book, Steve is in dire straits, of course, and he goes and sees his brother in Houston. And that's Marion Paul, who's now the main character of this book and the third one. He's become the main character, really, the protagonist, that is, to fight these villains. But he wanted to find out what happened to his brother. And he went there to save him, and he goes into a coma in the second book. And when he wakes up, he's gone through this awful nightmare of Terra Drake, but he's never seen her. And like a third of the way through the second book is when he sees her for the very first time. And he is a detective based on my brother Josh, who's in Houston. He's a detective, and he's been in internal affairs. He's been a homicide before, and he has been such an inspiration for Marion Paul. And Josh helps me with the legal parts and so on. But Marion in Terra Sabbath turns the novel more into a detective story and horror story blended with who is this woman, why is she doing it, and he comes across the different characters of Adrian Kane and the different witches. This book's more of a witchcraft book than demon book, because there's characters. For example, there's a character in there called Bridget Magnus.
Yes.
And Bridget Magnus is a creepy, creepy witch.
She's the scariest convenience store employee I'll ever meet. Okay.
And I'll tell you the story of it quickly. I was at the convenience store just down here in Morgan, and my settings of these books is Morgan, but it's called Duncan. I was at the convenience store and I saw one of the cashiers there who, a broken woman, clearly a woman who's gone through addiction herself. You could see it in every way. But I turned her into this Bridget Magnus character, and Bridget Magnus is also historically based on one of the very first witches who was killed in the Salem witch trials. And I go into that quite a bit in detail in the third book. But she's one of the witches that Terra Drake has under her spell. There's another one where when Marion wakes up in the hospital, he meets Dr. Pinole, who's one of the first characters, and also Janet Stone, who is the assistant there at the hospital, and ends up driving Marion back to this place that he inherited now from his brother. But while he's going through this, he sees that this Janet Stone and Bridget Magnus and this Dr. Jacqueline Pinole, these are witches that have been with Terra and are part of taking over what's going on in the modern world, the evils and the horrors that we're facing. These witches represent that.
So in this first book, it's more of Stephen Paul battling for his soul. The second book, it's a larger confederation trying to have an impact on the world, right?
It
and
really
you have
is.
a character named Adrian Kane. Tell us a little bit about him.
Adrian Kane, I went back biblically on this as well, and a lot of religions will come up with ideas and thoughts that Cain, original Cain from Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, is still alive on the earth today. In fact, our own faith kind of has this kind of idea. Well, I took that and ran with it. And Adrian Kane can be represented as Cain, the very first murderer. But Marion meets Cain in different ways. The bridge right over here is where he very first sees it.
I was thinking that when I was coming up here, right?
So Marion's out here one night. He's out there and he's seeing everything, and he sees lights up here that could be another type of element. Could be UFO, could be supernatural, which is all intertwined in these books. But he's out there and he sees Cain on the bridge, because there's a truck out there that's crashed in the middle of the river, and Marion's out there. He sees this tall, giant cowboy type guy, terrifying, and ends up being Adrian Kane. That's one way he sees him. But a little later in the novel, he ends up going to Cain's home, which is Stan Smith's home, but Cain's taking it over. And he has an entirely different appearance, a more manicured type of effeminate character who's kind of chiseled and blocked, and he goes through a terrifying moment in that house.
I remember that scene, yes.
To meet Adrian there. And that kind of intertwines throughout the book. And the end of this book, I won't give it away, but he has to continue overcoming what's going on with Terra and Cain and all these witches, and he hasn't come to the conclusion yet of what's happened with his brother.
You have scenes in this book, and also I've read parts of the last one, where it's almost like a convention of these people, meeting at times, right? And they're having things like, well, I don't want to get into details for the readers, but they have, they wallow in things that are better left unwallowed in some of these conventions.
They do.
And Marion Paul, he is definitely your main protagonist in these books.
He's the focal point. He's the protagonist going after this.
There are a lot of theological implications to these books, although they're not religious books. Well, you might say they are. But
it's a good versus evil.
Yeah,
it is.
Good versus evil. But you also have a character who represents John the Beloved.
I do.
Talk about him a little bit.
I do. I think that these, and the last podcast I did with another friend of mine named Eric Bond, he did a show with me, and we talked about the language in the books and the stories of these books and how heavy they are and dark with horror.
They are dark horror, yes.
It is, and I understand that. My publisher understands it. They've done really well, though, and that's a great thing. But the other thing about it is there had to be some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. It can't just constantly hit the reader and say, oh my God, is there ever going to be a situation where there's some hope here, where there's some relief? And another religious character or a spiritual character in the Bible, John the Beloved, is also in some religions believed to still be alive on the earth. And I said, okay, let's take that guy and let's have him appear from time to time to really help out the situation. And he did with Stephen Paul in the first one. And he does help out Marion in the second one when he's in some real deep situations. There's a diner scene in this novel. And Marion walks in and he sees a situation where Hitler and Stalin are having a discussion. And there's witches on the other area of it. And there's another witch in there named Rebecca who becomes another character in the third book. But John appears in that diner and sits Marion down and does what he can to guide him through what he's going to face. And if you stick true to what he believes in and what he fights for, that he can win against these forces of Terra and Cain.
And that character respects agency, doesn't he? He's
He
not
does.
going to wave a magic wand
He does not
and fix
wave
things.
exactly. And at the end of the book, there is this witches' fest. I won't give it away, but there's a battle between Marion and Terra, and John does appear there, but he does not wave a magic wand. He doesn't. But the evils of Terra and Cain respect John completely.
Yes, they do.
And they're almost under his authority if John does that.
And I like that.
And I like that contrast.
Because a lot of dark horror movies and even some books allow, and you and I have had disagreements about this, but they allow evil to triumph.
They do.
Over what I picture to be good. But I like the agency. The agency always should be important. One more thing I want to mention. There are two individuals in this book who basically are souls being fought over, right? By the forces of darkness, and also Marion trying to save these people.
There absolutely is. In this book, Marion meets a lady named Nina Frost. And Nina Frost, because they don't have enough time together in this book, I developed them a lot in the third book. I won't give anything away, of course, but it's a love interest for him. And Nina meets Terra Drake because Nina is a fashion promoter and she works at a fashion shop, and she ends up going to this awful witches fest at Terra's home up in Park City, which I call Snow Crest City, but she is one of those characters. The second character is Marion's daughter, Casey Paul. And so at the end of this book, there's this, pardon the motorcycle, at the end of this novel, Marion does find himself in a situation where he has to save them somehow, and I'll leave it there.
And Marion has a conflicted relationship to some degree with his daughter, right?
He does.
So he's trying to also win back her trust and things like that.
They haven't had a good relationship. It's been a terrible divorce. They've been estranged. So she doesn't really have anything to do with him. Even after the coma, she doesn't really care because she doesn't really know anything. And of course her uncle has died, and these things have happened. And he has to come to grips with that, while at the same time he loves this Nina character. At least he thinks he does.
You managed to convey in the novels the almost overwhelming odds against your protagonists, all right?
They are overwhelming.
I mean,
and the third one even more so.
And they're still trying as hard as they can to win what almost at times seems like a battle that's probably not going to win at times.
It's not going to win at times. And I'll tell you, Doug, the main inspiration for that again is my brother Josh, and I have to give him such credit as part of that character, because I look up to him as a police officer and what he's seen in Houston, and this is a man who's never given way to the dark side. He is a police officer who has remained strong and true and kept his family, and I wanted Marion to represent that, but also the odds against him they're overwhelming. And many times he loses to get to the next part to try and to win the battle overall.
I got to ask you this question. It just came out of the blue spontaneously. Do you sometimes have problem with people who are locked into an idea of what a novel should be or a film should be, saying, I'm not going to read this because it's got lots of bad language in it or something?
I do.
Do you deal with that?
I do, and I gave a presentation a couple of years ago when the first novel was released, and I think we talked about this, but I know from experience the horrors that I write about here, and you can't hold back. The language is harsh, it's ugly, and you can't be afraid to embrace that.
No, you can't.
You cannot be. And so you'll see heavy language in there and the profanity and so forth. But you're dealing with a cop on the streets of Houston who I show come alive in this small town and overcoming or fighting these demons. That is who he is, and that is who these people are. And you get a demonic character like Terra Drake. There's a scene in the first book where she will terrify you with some teenagers that she finds walking down the street.
Yeah.
She doesn't ever hold back.
No, she doesn't.
And that kind of thing I have embraced, because if you're a believer in God and you know that we have to try and overcome the devil, he's going to throw everything at you, including whatever it is your weakness. It's not going to be PG-13.
Yeah, I
ever.
agree. I agree.
It will never be that way. In fact, it's my wife who told me one time we were talking about all this. She said to me that Satan, the devil, he's not PG-13.
Life is R-rated, right?
It is. And it kind of hit home, because Terra Drake is far from that. And there are scenes in there, yes, that can be hard to get through and harrowing and sometimes offensive. But that is what these people go through to try and overcome the evil and remain true to their own character.
Before we get to the third book a little bit, you do draw historical figures and even contemporary figures of evil in your novels, right? Do you want to expound on that a little
Absolutely,
bit?
especially in the third book. And I'll kind of give a little teaser here. But there's a chapter in the third book called, actually it's the second chapter, it's called Midnight Cocktails with Jack the Ripper. It opens up in 1888, and Jack the Ripper does become a character in this third book. And I like to use history, because if you're talking about a character who's drenched in history since being Lilith, if you will, or being part of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man, if you will, you're going to have to be historical. And using some of these characters, I think, enriches it historically, and it makes it come alive. I did a lot of research on Jack the Ripper. There's some scenes in there I think that are forensically spot on, that I think are going to just be a knockout.
That's good. Now, the third book, what's it called?
The Harlot and the Beast.
And that's part 3. This is a trilogy,
Yeah,
right?
this is part 3.
And is there anything more? When's it going to come out?
I'm done with the manuscript. I'll get it to the publisher this next week, and we're shooting for October release publication around the haunted season, which will be great.
That'll be good. And your books have been the top seller for TWB Press, right?
They have. This was the top seller last year, and we're quite proud of that. It's exciting.
I can just see this. I can see,
But you can see the world now.
I can see
this world.
I can see the settings now more clearly what I've read in your books, because this is the first time I've actually been to your house. The first thing I noticed was the bridge type thing and everything.
Right.
And so it adds a little bit of it. Talk a little bit about, I know this involves trying to get someone interested, but would you like to see it made into film sometime?
I would love to see it.
Yeah?
I think when we write books, we want to see them come alive on screen. And if it does well enough, you never know. But we have talked about this, and recently we went and saw the film Maxine, and this actress, Mia Goth, I've thought, if anybody could be Terra Drake, to get it in the hands of somebody like her, she could make that character come alive.
Tell us a little bit about the Terra Drake on these pictures.
Terra Drake here is an actual model in Moscow, Russia, and her name is Alfia Mankina. And it's an incredible story. And I've said it before, I've told it before, but we were looking for a model for the first book, and the ones that the publisher and I were going back and forth with, it just didn't work. They just seemed too campy. And my wife is who found Alfia. She was looking through some Gothic art, and this model had some Gothic photography out there that was just, wow, that's Terra Drake. And I ended up meeting her husband first. His name is Sergei, and Sergei was immediately, it's on a site, the Russian site that's equivalent to Facebook. And long story short, Sergei, I was able to talk to him, and I asked him for permission to use this artwork, and they were
cool.
So excited. So she is the model for this in the first book, and there's images of Terra on the website that they did a specific photo shoot for that. So we're complimented on that.
It's a pity right now you don't have communication because of the war right now, right?
The war, we haven't had a lot of communication. I've spoken to him a couple times here and there, but it's just a different situation.
What is your website?
My website is DeanPatrickHorror.com.
Yeah,
you can
and
buy the novels there, my short stories and books. And
yeah, because you mentioned the short story, the very first one. What was it called again? She. These are available in periodicals.
Periodicals,
And
they're
you
anthologies.
can get them at your website. And
My
also,
website, you can get them on Amazon,
you have
Barnes
an
and
Amazon
Noble.
page
I got an
also?
Amazon page, Barnes and Noble, Book Nook.
Okay, I want to get a little bit into the personal side about some of your past experiences. I know you've conquered, I don't know if you ever say you've conquered it fully, but you've conquered alcohol for a long time now, and how that might have influenced some of the writing.
I think that going through alcoholism and addiction has influenced every story I've written. That's where Terra Drake came from, was on the floor of a jail cell in a prison rehab. But I know that for me as an author, what I want to resonate with is fellow addicts, fellow alcoholics that feel like there's no hope, that cannot overcome it, because so many cannot. Just last month I celebrated 8 years sober, and I attribute that for my wife has helped me through that so much, but I have found the writing has helped it by talking about these, I guess it's elements of evil that we find ourselves in when we're in our addiction. And any alcoholic, any addict who's going through that or has gone through it knows that these demons are different and they hit us differently. So that has been such a driving force with these books to show how bad it can get, but that you can overcome it.
And you, so you have empathy for people who are dealing with these things, but you also understand when they're probably not really dealing with it, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
When you see someone in recovery who is serious about it, there's a difference, there really is, as opposed to somebody who doesn't take it seriously and thinks that after they've been sober or clean for a few months or a year that they've got it under control. And I can share you right now, Doug, a story, and I think I did this with this last show I did, but this past year for me has been the most difficult year staying sober for a variety of reasons. And I had a counselor of mine that I still see, and she told me once that there's going to come a time in long-term sobriety where suddenly, whatever reason it'll be, will become very, very hard daily. And it has been. This has been a very hard year to manage sobriety. And I call it management because it will be something I die with. It's the thing that I have to be aware of at all times. And if I can resonate with readers out there through horror or through scaring them, but also giving entertainment as well, I can tell them that you can remain sober and clean, but you have to do the work, and it requires a lot of work. It truly does.
All right, well, I want to thank you. Remember, Pat Nielsen, author. His pen name is Dean Patrick. You can get Lady Mephistopheles and Terra Sabbath right now. Pick them up. And maybe when the third one comes out, you might sell it as a trio. Who knows?
We're going to try. We're going to sell the trio, but it is at deanpatrickhorror.com and twpress.com.
And this is Plan9Crunch. We're at Facebook, but we're also on YouTube. Subscribe to us, and we're on TikTok. And we have a Plan9Crunch.com blog also. And we thank Pat for his time. Won't be the first time we talk to him, I guarantee you that. We're eager for the new book.
It's been an honor.
Thanks. And that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.